that we have this appreciation of theory and the state concept, we can start moving into some practical matters. And especially in the afternoon, Professor Kramer will present the simplified method. And the reasons why what we've talked about is so important is, in many respects, the simplified method is too simple. And with a computer program, spreadsheet, anyone can be taught to do the simplified method. What distinguishes a good geotechnical earthquake engineer from an average one is the person who can recognize the nuances and the differences from different soils that all don't perfectly fit within the empirical database. And that concept of steady state and the critical state framework provides you a tool to understand those nuances and use your engineering judgment to make modifications when it's appropriate. We talked about the threshold strain concept yesterday. It's very useful to talk about the volumetric threshold strain, which for a clean sand is about 10 to the minus 2%. When we were talking about dynamic properties, such as the shear modulus reduction curve and the damping curve. But that same concept is so critical in terms of understanding soil behavior. I mentioned that the SEED 1979 paper is one of the most important papers to read. Even though it is, 50 years old? It is still a classic. Harry Seed is considered, at least in the US, as the father of geotechnical earthquake engineering, especially when it comes to liquefaction. And so the journal said, you can take as many pages as you want to write down your opinions, your perspective on soil liquefaction. It's a great paper. Ricardo Dobry wrote the most brave discussion that was ever written, because Ricardo Dobry and Chuck Ladd actually wrote a discussion of the paper that the late Professor Harry Seed wrote in '79. And what they realized is the data that Harry Seed had plotted in terms of stresses had a lot of variability, and there was some confusion about what was going on. They took that same data and they plotted excess pore pressure ratio versus the log of the shear strain, and all the data, and I'll show you the plot from Harry Seed's paper, all that data coalesced or came together in terms of this kind of plot, and said, actually, strain is more fundamental than stress. If you move from a stress-based method to a strain-based method, everything's unified, because if you get cyclic shear strains that are less than 10 to the minus 2%, recognize this is engineering strain, so if I do it in the normal percentages, this is 10 to the minus 2%. I have no pore pressure generation. If I don't strain the soil, it will not build up excess pore pressure. When the soil starts to strain, then that response, in volumetric response of contraction, is expressed as a positive excess pore pressure. In fact, I remember Clarence Chan relating the story of when Harry Seed and him tried to do their first simple shear test. They took a box of sand and they shook it back and forth, and nothing happened. They had to make it a direct simple shear device. They had to strain the saturated soil to get the buildable pore pressure. So this is an important concept in saying, if I can do things to limit how the earthquake induces shear strain, I can limit the generation of excess pore pressure. As Professor Kramer mentioned, it's not just the amplitude of the cyclic stress, it is also the equivalent number of cycles of loading. So we often use magnitude for that, but more fundamentally in a laboratory test, we look at applying different cyclic stress ratios and counting the number of cycles until liquefaction is triggered. As Professor Kramer mentioned, there's many different definitions of liquefaction. The classic definition, which works in clean sands, most clean sands, is a pore pressure ratio, which is equal to the excess pore pressure developed during the test, divided by what was the vertical effective stress, or the initial confining pressure. Once you reach close to 100%, you call that liquefaction. Sometimes this criteria doesn't work, and especially for more siltier soils or some denser soils, we may not get to 100% pore pressure generation. And as an engineer, what we care about is strain. So in a cyclic triaxial test, we might use 3% single amplitude strain. Professor Ishihara likes to use 5% double amplitude axial strain. I typically look at both of those, but my preference is using 3% single amplitude strain. The key is that you define that so whoever reads your papers or your reports knows what you're saying is liquefaction. Gravels don't build up as much strain, so the work done in gravels, like Kukushko and others, have largely used 2% double amplitude axial strain in a cyclic triaxial device. A simple shear test can be argued as being a better test than a cyclic triaxial test. And in fact, I think that's a pretty easy argument in most cases, because you're directly capturing the shear mode of vertically propagating horizontal shear waves. And there are different conventions. Many people use 3.75% shear strain in one direction as the definition of liquefaction. Others use 5% shear strain. I like to always use both to see how different they are, and then pick one. I typically go 5% shear strain. Once we have a definition, let's say we picked RU equal to 100%, then if we apply test series A, B, and C, same soil, same relative density, same confining pressure, and all that's different is the CSR is 0.12, 0.18, 0.30. I can tell they're plotting shear stress divided by vertical effective stress, so I know that this is a cyclic simple shear test. At the low shear stress ratio, it takes many cycles to reach liquefaction. It takes 40 cycles. And you can see the response. Most of the cycles, you can't differentiate them because only at the end does it go through the liquefaction and soften dramatically. At the higher CSR, it takes fewer cycles to generate the case of RU equal to 100%. It takes 10 cycles, and at a very high cyclic stress ratio, it only takes 2 cycles. And so you connect them together, and you get a line between those combinations of CSR, cyclic stress ratio, and number of cycles that do not lead to triggering, and then those combinations that do, so that CSRs that are along this line become what we call the cyclic resistance ratio. So we can think of it as a cyclic resistance, a strength, and we can think of cyclic stress ratio as a demand. I put this blue line on here to make you realize that the laboratory tests will never copy exactly the stress and strain path in the field, so you'll have to make modifications to your laboratory test to adjust them to what is the field conditions. We know that to be true because if we take exactly the same soil and we test it in a simple shear device and we tested the cyclotriaxial device, we get a difference. So these are some tests done by Rodolfo Sancio on Adipazari silt. These are the definitions of the applied shear stress, number of cycles, and we have the cyclic stress ratio that causes liquefaction, or the CRR, for the simple shear test, related to the triaxial test. The triaxial test has a cyclic deviator stress. Half of that is the shear stress on a 45-degree plane, and then the confining pressure is the isotropic consolidation stress. So that tells you this is a triaxial test, and they're related by this factor C sub r. For a normally consolidated clean sand, it's around 0.63, and there's differences depending on different aspects of it. Professor Ishihara came up with this relationship, which I use, because as you go from a clean sand that might have a K naught of 0.45, that's normally consolidated, to more of a silty sand, to more of a silt, K naught increases for a normally consolidated soil. It also increases for an over-consolidated soil. So you can bring in that relationship and tie the cyclic triaxial test, which is less expensive, easier to run, and more widely available, to the simple shear test, which is probably a better test. Well, even the simple shear test is not reality because it's unidirectional shaking. And an earthquake, you get bidirectional shaking. So Bob Pike did some work between a simple shear test with one-dimensional shaking and two-dimensional simple shear test. And the assumption is a two-dimensional bidirectional simple shear test is the field, and the relationship is around 0.9. That number has been used for many years. Annie Camera did some testing and showed for different stress paths, it's actually not always 0.9. Life is not that simple. So this is an oversimplification. Annie showed it could be much different than this, but hasn't yet told us why, so we still stick with this 0.9. Obviously, a cyclotriaxial test has to be converted with CR to make it a unidirectional simple shear test, and then times by 0.9 to get the field. The key issue is different laboratory tests produce different results, but we have a framework for correcting those results to what we should get in the field. In the end, you don't care about the soil response in the laboratory, you care about the soil response in the field. So always correct them to the field response. You cannot cross the graduation stage at Berkeley without reciting the 5 factors that are principally controlling liquefaction of a sand in the absence of testing device, once you've taken that variable out. And this was the primary contribution by the late Professor Harry Seed in his 1979 paper. All the work done by his students, he pulled it together and said, relative density matters. Shouldn't shock anyone. Fabric matters. Stress history matters. Age matters. Young people, you get better with age. You get closer to death, but you also get better. And stress history. So let's talk about relative density. These are laboratory tests. This is a very nice description because they're telling you how it was built. Dry pluviation of Toyota sand, isotropically consolidated. These are cyclic torsional shear tests because I'm seeing a shear stress divided by a vertical effective stress, or they could be simple shear tests. I'm not quite sure actually. It's probably cyclic torsional shear given who the authors are. And then they tell you the number of cycles to 3% double amplitude shear strength. So they're being very clear on what they're saying is liquefaction. This is the CSR. These are the log number of cycles to liquefaction. So these are the CRR line for the soil when when prepared to a relative density of 40%, 50, 60, 70, and 80. And you see the clear importance of relative density. The strength of the soil, the cyclic resistance ratio, systematically increases as you get to higher relative densities. Or for an applied stress field, it takes more cycles of loading to get to the limit of liquefaction. If you look at the actual test results, you can see some of the details that Professor Kramer was talking about in terms of the loose soil building up a lot of pore pressure initially, then slowly building up pore pressure, and then as it gets to a high RSU, things really take off and get bad very quickly, and you get to liquefaction. And so you don't really see much going on, although you're building up pore pressures, but then when you get close to liquefaction, things really go bad quickly for that loose soil that has a highly contracted response tendency under a relatively moderate to higher confining pressure. The dense soil is shown here, and you can see it takes a higher CSR to get the buildup of pore pressure, but it does build up pore pressure. It never quite gets to P prime equal to 0. And so you get this initial response, and you do get softening, but then it dilates. And you get softening, and then it dilates. And you are incrementally, slowly building up strain for each cycle. But that's very different than this phenomenon, which looks like it's a strain softening, brittle response, cyclic mobility with unlimited strain potential, or large, very large strain potential, versus this cyclic mobility with limited strain potential. If I showed you this plot of some of the tests I've done on low plasticity silts with angular particles, they would almost look the same. So if we're going to call this a liquefaction phenomenon for a dense, clean sand, I would like to call it a liquefaction phenomenon for a low plasticity loose silt. If we look at relative density, and we do these tests and plot them out this way, we can take a certain number of cycles. In this case, they took 20 cycles and took the cyclic resistance ratio of the soils at different relative densities at the same number of cycles. And of course, as you saw in that plot, as the relative density increases, the cyclic resistance ratio increases as well. And so we see the difference between a 40% relative density material that has a low cyclic resistance ratio at 20 cycles of loading versus a higher density material that maybe has 0.18. And then there are relative densities where we can say we're not going to get triggering of liquefaction. If you look at the details of these soils in terms of relative density, it's not just that at a certain number of cycles, such as 20 cycles, that a soil resistance increases as the relative density increases. Look at the shape. When you're at low relative densities, the line is relatively flat. This test series has 54% relative density. If I had something that was maybe at 30% relative density, it would be very flat as well as being lower. As you go to higher relative densities, it not only increases in resistance, but you get more curvature. Why this is important is we're going to use these test results and their curvature as a basis for the equivalent number of cycles and applied load that causes liquefaction. The shapes of these are the basis of the magnitude scaling factor that we're going to talk about in the afternoon. This is silt. Professor Seed, in his 79 paper, talked about clean sands. With the work following Adipazori, we brought some of the Adipazori silt back to Berkeley and did cyclic simple shear tests. And we can see the obvious things in terms of void ratio. You can't talk about relative density easily for these kinds of soils, but we can talk about void ratio. And the Brown test has a void ratio of 0.96. Blue is 0.92. And you can see the obvious thing here in terms of number of cycles to a certain shear strain level. We use 5% single amplitude strain in these simple shear tests. It only took 4 cycles of loading of the high void ratio material. Everything else being the same, it took 8 cycles for the lower void ratio material. You can see the buildup of pore pressure is more rapid in the looser silt than in the slightly denser silt. And you can see that you don't get to an RU equal to 0. One is, in these tests run at 1 hertz, we can't measure excess pore pressure in the specimen reliably because you get pore pressures being generated in the middle of the specimen, but you're measuring pore pressures in the porous stones on the outside. So you have to be mindful of pore pressure equalization before you start showing effective stress plots. So we know this concept is important, and we know the state parameter allows us to unify the responsive soils at different void ratios and different effective stresses on either the contractive side or the dilative side. So relative density is important, but it's actually relative density and effective stress, and therefore state parameter is even more informative than relative density. How about fabric? This is out of the Seed 1979 paper. It's based on some work that his graduate student did earlier that he represented. Again, a nice plot because he tells you cyclic stress ratio. Because he's saying plus or minus a cyclic deviator stress divided by 2 times the mean effective stress or the effective confining pressure, we know this is the cyclic triaxial test. And then they're giving you a clear definition of liquefaction triggering for these curves above. And it's the number of cycles to a peak cyclic pore pressure ratio of 100% and at least plus or minus 2% axial strain. When both of those have been met, they're calling that liquefaction. All of these tests were done at the same confining pressure on the same soil, Monterey sand. All of these were compacted to exactly the same relative density within a factor of 0.1. So it took a lot of time to nail this by building the soil at different techniques to the same relative density. Even though these soils have exactly the same relative density, and we know how important relative density is, we see that it doesn't capture everything. Pluviation through air is weaker than pluviation through water, which is different than dry rotting. Moist tamping is a popular technique for building soils in the laboratory. Maybe it reflects compaction in the field. It's significantly higher than pluviation through water. A lot of soil deposits are built by nature and they're pluviation through water. And if I use high frequency vibrations and really beat that soil up in the laboratory while I'm building it, I get a much higher resistance. So when you are building a soil in the field and you have the chance to be cruel and mean and violent to that soil, do it. Con gusto. Con gusto? Con gusto. You take a soil or a person who grew up in this gentle little area and they've never been stressed out in life. They may have gotten to a certain density, but they're kind of metastable. You take that same person and have them grow up on the streets of New York. Okay? They're going to be tough. They're going to basically be more resistant. And you take them out of New York and put them in Chicago, they're going to be fine. Okay? You take that person who grew up in a little idyllic small town and put them in Chicago, it's going to be a lot of stress. So it's not just the relative density, it's not just the relative compaction when you're building the soil in your field, it's the way you form the soil. Vibratory rollers and putting vibratory energy in, the more energy you put into building the soil, the more stable and resistant that soil is, even at the same relative density. But when nature builds a soil, or we, because we want to save money, drop sand through water to build a hydraulic fill, we are building it by pluviation through water. Even at the same density, it's weaker than if we had used vibratory compaction. Fabric is being built by the way the specimen is built, or the way nature is building the soil. And it doesn't determine the eventual final home of the steady state line, because that should be fabric independent. But it does affect the point of the quasi-steady state line. And so in a practical way, we care more about the quasi-steady state line, and it's a function of fabric that tells us that we need to be mindful of fabric. Stress history. These are laboratory tests done on silt. Dr. Donahue, at that time, had to basically build specimens that had about the same board ratio. She did a reasonable job of that. Obviously, the soil that she over-consolidated, she had to build much looser, consolidate it, and then unload it. She did tests at normally consolidation, an OCR of 2, and an OCR 3.25. You can see that the normally consolidated soil failed in just 5 cycles. The soil that had been consolidated to a higher stress that was twice its vertical effective stress at the time of testing, and then unloaded to that vertical effective stress at the time of testing, it took 37 cycles, and we actually did not get to liquefaction after more than about 60 cycles for the heavily over-consolidated soil. So we know that, again, if you put a high stress on the soil, you increase K0, you make the soil a little bit more resistant, and then you unload it, because of the plastic response, it doesn't fully jump back, you've made it more resistant at the same relative density, or the same void ratio. Age. These are test results done where most of the tests we did, we built the specimen and we failed it 8/10 of a day after we built it. To make things constant, we had to hold that constant. So most of our tests, we build the specimen, we wait 8/10 of a day, and then we test it. So it's under sustained load for 8/10 of a day. But then we said, okay, let's look at time effects. Most soils are not damaged or not excited by an earthquake a day after they're built. So let's build the specimen, hopefully the same void ratio, not the same void ratio, and let's wait 50 days and then test it. And you can see that the cycle resistance ratio increases dramatically. It takes 2 cycles for the young soil, and this older soil takes 7 cycles. This is what the late Professor Harry Seed saw for clean sand. He has a plot that we're superimposing our results on for silt. These results were for clean sand. He shows the cycle resistance ratio after some sustained loading divided by that for a freshly deposited specimen. And so 1 day, 10 days, 100 days after sustained loading. Clean sands have this aging effect where they get a little bit more resistant to liquefaction with age. This is in the absence of cementation and other things that could make this even a bigger effect. This is just cold welding, maybe a little bit of secondary compression, minor variations in fabric. A low plasticity silt, it doesn't know the 200 sieve was ever invented. So a very coarse silt shouldn't be that different than a very fine sand. It follows that pretty well. But as you go to a higher PI, higher plasticity index silt, it's more compressible, and we'd expect more time effects. We see more time effects with clay than we do for sand, so there should be this gradation from sands to intermediate materials to clays. Sometimes people say, because the soil has liquefied, it will not re-liquefy. But this is a case where it does. This soil probably liquefied 100 to 200 years ago. There's some evidence that there was a major event in Christchurch that caused liquefaction before the area was developed. But this is what a geologist does after a liquefaction event. They go out in their backyard and they take a picture of the ejecta. That was the Darfield earthquake on 4 September 2010. Then they had the lower magnitude, but closer distance Christchurch earthquake, 7.0 magnitude. This was now a 6.2 magnitude, but it was closer, maybe only 3 to 5 kilometers away, and there was much more extensive liquefaction. Even a minor aftershock, I think a 4.6 earthquake on 16 April caused a little bit of ejecta. Then in June, on the 13th of June, they had a 5.4 type event, and then 80 minutes later, they had a 6.0. Liquefaction happens where liquefaction has happened. I've heard statements in some countries that say, we have so many earthquakes. The soil has liquefied, densified. We'll never get liquefaction again. No. One of the worst things that happens to a soil is it liquefies. Maybe the bottom of that deposit gets a little denser, but the upper part is pluviating through water when it resediments. It is loose, it is young, it is prime for liquefaction. When we had the 1989 Loma Prieta earthquake in Northern California, the first thing we did is we went to the 1906 report and we looked where they reported liquefaction in 1906. And every place that was strongly shaken in 1989 that liquefied in 1906, we found liquefaction. So, a site that has liquefied, if you have geologic evidence of sand boils and sand dikes, and it has liquefied, it's going to liquefy again if it's shaken by a similar event. The age of a soil is not the age of when it was born, when it was formed, or the age of the organics within the soil. The age of the soil in terms of liquefaction is the time since it was last liquefied. So if you have an old soil that has not liquefied for 10,000 years, then you have an aging effect that you can take advantage of. But if that 10,000-year-old soil liquefied a month ago, its age is a month. It has been reborn, and it is a new material, and it is likely to liquefy for a new event. So there is a thing that if you get minor shaking without significant pore pressure generation and without liquefaction, yes, that does increase the resistance slightly, but everything changes when it liquefies and is born again. And that's the seismic history here. This is only for cases that do not have liquefaction, where with minor cyclic loading that does not generate significant pore pressure, things get moved around into a slightly more stable arrangement. But do not use that factor to say that an old soil will not liquefy, because age depends on the last liquefaction event. So life is easy. we have laboratory tests. All we need to do is say we know the cyclic resistance ratio depends on density, fabric, stress history, aging, seismic history, among other factors. So all you need to do is get high quality, undisturbed specimens, preserve all of these characteristics, and you can do nice laboratory testing. How do you do that for a clean sand that is contractive in drain shear? When you sample it with a sampling device, you're shearing it. You're doing that test relatively slowly, so it's drain shear, it contracts. So the soil in the laboratory is more dense than the soil in the field. You are being unconservative when you do laboratory tests on highly contracted soils that have contracted and densified because of the sampling process. Sample disturbance is why the late Professor Harry Seed, who had built up a lab to do a lot of laboratory tests, gave up and resorted to something as archaic, as basic, as simple as taking a sample device and pounding it in the ground and counting the number of blows it takes to drive it 30 centimeters. If CPT existed at the time, he would have used CPT. But all he had at that time was the SPT. He's a practical person. He had to provide some guidance, so he used the SPT procedure with the late proceed with the alive at Idris. And this is the demonstration we see over and over again. If you do relatively expensive frozen sampling, and the Japanese are the people who have invented and perfected this technique, on a clean sand, you can see that when you reconstitute the specimen in the lab, at the same relative density, you get very low strengths and you get a relatively flat curve. When you take an undisturbed specimen of that same sand, by the proper technique, you get the resistance to be a lot higher in this case. So, you can do frozen sampling, but it's difficult. And you can't do frozen sampling on silty soils, and especially silts, because we know as you do the freezing front, you get ice lens, and you're actually disturbing the specimen. So when would you ever use lab tests to evaluate liquefaction? If you're building the soil in the field, and you're wise enough to build it in the lab the same way, you can count on those laboratory tests. So when you're going to build a field, make sure your laboratory program builds the soil the same way in the lab so you can compare apples to apples. Research projects. We learned about the 5 factors because all those PhD students working for the late Professor Harry Seed. And I learned about the effects on silts by having Jennifer Donahue and Rodolfo Sansu do a bunch of tests on silty soils. And so laboratory tests still provide tremendous insight and are useful on research. Fine-grained soils. The late Professor Harry Seed gave up on sampling clean sands because it's so hard to sample those. But a slightly plastic clayey silt can be sampled, and my preferred way is the Dames & Moore hydraulic fixed piston sampler. There are other sampling devices out there. The Shelby tube is not a good sampler. There are other Osterberg type fixed piston samplers that have the criteria that meet thin-walled sampling. But there aren't better samplers than the Dames & Moore. Why? It's made of brass, not steel. Feel the inside of your tube of steel, and they're always rough. Brass is smooth. But the other thing is it only shoots about 45 centimeters, where most other ones shoot 90 centimeters. The longer you shoot, the more you're going to get side friction and pile plugging, or sample plugging, and disturbance. And then coarse grain soils can be sampled with specialized equipment. Soil freezing, only by the Japanese. That's the only people I've seen do it right. So if I was In the United States, I would hire a Japanese firm to do this. There's a new technology called gel push that Professor Ishihara, Chumanovsky are working on. It has shown promise, but it is also done well and done poorly. What are other factors affecting liquefaction? There's loading frequency, confining pressure, fines, testing device we talked about. So for example, here's loading frequency. Here's a test that's done on the same silt, at the same void ratio, same confining pressure, same CSR, and when I load it at a frequency of 0.005 hertz, which is a slow rate of loading, so they can accurately measure the pore pressures, I get 5 cycles to liquefaction. When I load it at 1 hertz, which better reflects the earthquake loading, but doesn't allow me to have reliable pore pressure measurements, it takes 13 cycles. We know that soils that are a little bit plastic have viscosity, and we get a little bit of creep in each cycle, so we're getting more contraction, more pore pressure generation. So that's why I do most of my tests at 1 hertz and give up on measuring pore pressures and use a strain-based criteria for evaluating liquefaction. Confining pressure matters. Harry C. came up with the cyclic resistance ratio as the applied shear stress that causes liquefaction divided by the vertical effective stress it was loaded to. If that was a perfect normalization, I wouldn't talk about this topic. But we find that the vertical effective stress increases at a faster rate than the shear stress that causes liquefaction as depth increases. And so we see that for the same soil, the same relative density, when we go to increasing vertical effective stress, that ratio reaches liquefaction at a lower value. So at higher confining pressures, we're going to expect a K sigma value that's less than 1. In Adabazori, we saw this because they did not see liquefaction in the free field for the 1967 Maduro Valley earthquake, and I did not see liquefaction in the free field for the 1999 Khojaly earthquake. I saw liquefaction underneath buildings. As you put a building on the soil, you're increasing the vertical effective stress, and you're reducing the cyclic stress ratio necessary to cause liquefaction at a certain number of cycles. So if we pick 15 cycles, that's essentially telling us these relationships are giving us the cyclic resistance ratio at a confining pressure that's different than 1 atmosphere, normalized by that at 1 atmosphere, which is 100 kPa, the red line. And that's the basis of the K sigma plots that Professor Kramer will talk about. Because it's not just confining pressure, but it's the state parameter, it's relative density and confining pressure, we would expect these K sigma plots to be a function of relative density. In fact, if the relative density of the soil was 0%, there should be no K sigma. But as we go to increasing relative densities, we should see the K sigma value basically come down more. Now I'd like to talk about non-plastic fines. We've talked about this nice test set done by Sean Rees and Mishko Chumanovsky, where they looked at this relatively clean sand with just 1% fines, and then that same clean sand with only 10% fines. Here's the CRR for about 60% relative density, and here's the CRR for about 60% relative density. You can see in this side-by-side comparison that the soil with 10% fines has a lower CRR line than the one that has only 1% fines. But let's look at it this way, because it's clearer. Let's take and replot the data for the CSR that causes liquefaction as a function in a certain number of cycles, like 5 cycles. So let's look at that. What's the CSR that causes liquefaction in these 3 different soils in 5 cycles of loading as a function of the relative density of the soil? And so this is the CRR line for the clean sand, the sand that has 10% fines, and the sand that has 30% fines. And you can see for a given relative density that as you go from the 30% fines to 10 to 1, the resistance increases. This is data that was collected from other people that show the cyclic resistance ratio to cause liquefaction in 15 cycles, normalized by that which causes cyclic resistance ratio in 15 cycles for a clean sand as a function of increasing fines content. As the fines content increases, the cyclic resistance ratio decreases. When you look at this plot, it appears that given a blow count, clean sand has a cyclic resistance ratio of only 0.18. A soil with a fines content of 35% or greater has a higher resistance. People look at this plot and say silty soils are more resistant to liquefaction. That is a wrong look at the diagram. Let's look at it not from penetration resistance, but from relative density, which is more fundamental. Let's change N160 to relative density, because we can compare soils that have 1, 10, and 30% fines content with relative density. In fact, Professor Chubanowski has a relationship that changes blow counts into relative density for clean sands to silty sands. We can convert that over so we can develop a plot of blow count versus relative density, and we can see that what is actually happening for a given relative density, the blow count is lower. So fines are not making the soil have a higher CRR, a higher cyclic resistance ratio, a higher strength. Fines are making the penetration resistance lower. Fines reduce the penetration resistance. If we look at this in terms of relative density and not penetration resistance, we see that for a certain relative density, as you go to fewer fines, you go to higher resistances. So therefore, for a given relative density, the cyclic strength of the material decreases with increasing fines content. Going back to this example that I already showed to drive this home, soil with 10% fines content goes to the right. The effective stress increases. A soil with 30% fines at the same relative density goes to the left, and it goes to decreasing effective stresses. So flow potential increases with increasing fines content. So this is not the way to look at it. It looks like the cyclic resistance ratio of silty sands is greater than that, but that's because your mind has said, oh, the penetration resistance are the same. No. The way to look at it is this way. The soil actually reduces in penetration resistance. And so the fines content correction that people have in their simplified methods is the correction of adjusting the penetration resistance to get the right relative density. It is not anything other than that. It makes sense. If I have a clean sand and I add fines to it, it becomes more compressible. It's easier to penetrate the soil, even if the soil has the same relative density and the same confining pressure acting on it. Silty sands are not more resistant to liquefaction than clean sands. Silts liquefy. They haven't only liquefied in the laboratory, they have liquefied in the field. I have dozens upon dozens of pictures and case histories of extensive liquefaction of low plasticity silt soils in Athabasca. Now, whether you want to call it cyclic softening, cyclic failure, cyclic mobility with limited strain potential, it is a pore pressure generation, softening of the material, and a weakening of the material that causes bad things. So a unifying factor is the effects of liquefaction. There are other issues to look at, such as stress reversal. If I'm loaded in one direction and I go back like this, I'm more resistant. If I go like this and like that, I'm much more destructive to the soil fabric. So in this case, I have an initial static shear stress, but I'm loading it to where I'm getting full stress reversal. I get to a excess pore pressure ratio of 100%. That means at least for an instant, the effective stress is 0, and I get these larger strain phenomenon that we've been talking about. If I do a test with a biased shear stress with a lower applied stress ratio, so I never get stress reversal, the stress is always in one direction. It's bigger in one direction, and it's less in one direction. But I don't get that destruction of the stress reversal. I don't ever get to an RU of 100%, and I get the buildup of cyclic strains in that direction of the stress bias, but I don't get that incredible softening. I mean, I build up strains, but I don't get that softening you saw in the previous plot. So this is an easy topic. Cyclic responsive soil depends on these few factors. I'm being sarcastic. Relative density or void ratio, fabric, stress history, age, or time under confinement, stress history without the absence of liquefaction. When you have liquefaction, age is 0. But it depends on loading frequency, especially for more plastic soils, effective confining stress, fines content, testing device, which is load path in the field, the plasticity of the fines, the static shear stress, sloping ground, on and on and on and on. The more we learn about liquefaction, the more we learn we need to learn.